Hello, everyone. I'm Bob Jolly, Director of the St. Johnsbury Atheneum. Welcome to this Vermont Humanities Council First Wednesday program with UVM Professor Luis Vivanco. Also here tonight is Sahra Ali, Communications Production Manager with the Vermont Humanities Council. Just a couple of notes. Tonight's program is being recorded for possible future broadcast. If you don't want to be recorded, please turn off your video. You'll see, but you won't be seen. Questions have to come through the chat function, so please type them in at any time, and we'll get to as many as possible. We may ask some during the presentation. The statewide sponsors for the entire First Wednesday season are the Vermont Department of Libraries and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The underwriter for tonight's talk is the University of Vermont Office of Engagement. The Atheneum underwriter for the entire series is Adler and McCabe PLC and the Friends of the St. Johnsbury Atheneum. Next month's First Wednesday talk, hosted by the St. Johnsbury Atheneum, is The Legacy of Nicholas Black Elk with historian Damian Costello. That talk will also be remote. To view all of the Vermont Humanities Council First Wednesday programs at 9 libraries around Vermont, go to vermonthumanities.org. Luis Vivanco is Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Humanities Center at the University of Vermont. He studied religion at Dartmouth and received his PhD in cultural anthropology from Princeton. He has taught at UVM since 1999. He researches environmental social movements in Costa Rica, Mexico, Colombia, and the US, the history of wildlife films, and urban bicycle use. He has 10 books, among them the widely used textbooks and the Oxford Dictionary of Cultural Anthropology. If you are near the Atheneum, you can check out Reconsidering the Bicycle. Luis is recipient of UVM's Kidder Outstanding Faculty Award for excellence in teaching, mentoring, and an ability to inspire students for lifelong learning. Here is Professor Luis Vivanco.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Sarah, for all the work you're doing behind the scenes to set this up. And thank you all for taking some time this evening to join me in the informative and entertaining dynamics of when the bicycle came to Vermont. And Bob, that was a very flattering introduction, and I hope it didn't give you too high expectations about what I'm going to do. But because I'm still a student of this particular issue, you'll note Bob didn't mention that I'm a historian, but I'm a historian in formation, and I want to tell the story of how and why I'm interested in this topic, and set the scene for how and why you might find some interest in this topic, even if you're not a bicycle nut like myself. So I am a cultural anthropologist, and my specialty is within the area of environmental anthropology, and I'm a scholar of environmental social movements and activism, and an everyday bicycle user. I've been around bicycles my whole life and worked on them and competed with them and run errands and commuted for years, but never really thought of them anthropologically in a systematic way until I got a modest question one day from a friend and colleague about, have you thought of studying bicycle transportation? And I thought, well, surely somebody's done this, and it's been done. Anthropologists their brains are like cabinets of curiosity. There's surely somebody's done it, but no one had really done it. So I was like, oh, this is curious. So it became a little bit of an auto anthropology, a sort of interest in how and why have I in my own life become so fascinated by bicycles. And so being a scholar of activism and social movements, I had already picked up that somehow, this is about 10 years ago, somehow, somewhere, bike movements were challenging urban leaders to make their cities more friendly to bicycles. And they were making all kinds of associations with sustainability and, the idea that the bicycle is a vehicle for a small planet, for example. And suddenly everything that I was doing on a day-to-day basis, I realized was being painted green. And it struck me that I'm a scholar of green movements, and I'm kind of curious about the way the bicycle is being used in that context. So I decided to write the book that, whoops, it's not maybe, there we go. I decided to write a book. It's a great way to learn something. And the book, it examines the sort of meanings of bicycles in different cultures and times, and the ways in which bicycles are being used in social movements around the world. And I was doing field work, ethnographic field work among bicycle riders here in Vermont. I've also done field work, long-term field work in Bogota, Colombia, where bicycles are taken very seriously, a little bit in Denmark. And in writing this book, there's a section on Burlington. And I knew going into that chapter that there was a history of interest and actually a real enthusiasm around bicycles that took place in Burlington in the 1880s and the 1890s. It was known as the first bicycle boom. And we're probably in the fourth now. There's various sort of moments of popular enthusiasm that the bicycle has enjoyed. And so I thought, okay, well, in this chapter, I'll have a little section on the history of bicycles in Vermont and Burlington. And I realized that nobody had done anything. I looked everywhere. I thought surely somebody's written a history of that, maybe even just a short few pages, but no one really had. And so consulting with my friend Glenn Ames, who owned a bike shop called Old Spokes Home here and is a historian, an amateur historian of bicycle technology, we just started looking into what was happening in Burlington and more broadly Vermont during that first bicycle boom in the 1880s and the 1890s. And I found all kinds of really interesting places where you could see bikes popping up, so they were in the newspapers for sure. So I was studying historic newspaper collections. I was reading letters, looking at photo collections and seeing them in the foreground or in the background. I was looking at maps and city directories and finding that there were locations that were associated with bicycling at that time. And there was this sort of untapped mountain of material, pretty much all of it unpublished. And so just a teeny bit ends up in this book. And I thought, wow, there's such great stories here. I need to share them. And so I developed this talk, which I'm going to give. And I also developed a history of bicycles, bicycle tour of Burlington to sort of look at the different places and the spaces in which bicycles were being used in interesting ways. And tonight you'll get a sense of some of that for sure. I've also ended up making research-based comics of this. And you might note that I posted in the chat a little link to a PDF, which it's a guide to this talk. And if we were in person, you would get a hard copy of this. It would be a little, either a cast off or a take-home souvenir. But I am going to refer to it in just a minute. So if you are interested, you can download that or you can just leave it there. It's up to you. But all of this is, I want to say, you don't have to be a bike nut like me to find this talk enjoyable and interesting. As a cultural anthropologist, I'm primarily interested in using the bicycle to illuminate some of the large social transformations and social conflicts and dynamics that were happening in Vermont's small towns and cities at the turn of the century. So bicycles to me are great by themselves on their own terms, but they're also a useful lens to think about other things. So I'm going to jump ahead now and just again, as a matter of introduction, just give you a quick sense of some of the bicycles we're really referring to here tonight. This is in that little handout. This is the first page. This field guide to 19th century bicycles starts at the top with a so-called draisine that was invented in 1817. And it was a Also known as dandy chargers, because dandies, male urban dandies, wealthy guys, were capturing the craze of the Draisine, and so they call them dandy chargers or velocipedes. These were running machines, but they're typically credited to be the first steps that led to the bicycle. They were two wagon wheels connected by a very heavy piece of wood. They had very limited steering and no brakes. And so you would run with these things, and if you hit a hill and started going down the hill, you would just more or less hope that you would throw your legs up and then hope for the best, hope that you didn't just eat it very badly on the way down. But a lot of these were being used in inside spaces, skating rinks and such. They weren't really great touring vehicles. But anyway, so that craze kind of came and went throughout the 1820s and 30s among the wealthiest of the wealthy, and in Europe, even in the United States, New York. But it's not until the late 1860s that we see a transformation begin to occur with that. And it's because somebody brought a Draisine into a wagon shop in Paris, the Michaud brothers. And there's big debate about who exactly did it, but a tinkerer in that workshop took the Draisine and thought to put a crank and pedal on the pedals on that front wheel. And it very quickly caught on, and they started producing what was called the velocipede. And these are the very first bicycles by that name. They were also known as bone shakers because they were very heavy, about 150 pounds or more. They're wagon wheels connected by a heavy wood frame there. And they were largely a curiosity that circus riders there were circus acts that adopted these things. But they were called bone shakers because if you had one and you wanted to ride anywhere, you were riding over rough ground, cobblestones, and just literally shaking you to the bones. There was no kind of shocks or anything to dampen the roads. The thing about the bone shaker is that as a direct drive vehicle, people wanted to go faster. And so the way you go faster with that kind of drive is you just grow that wheel. And so by 1871, we have the radical transformation of that bone shaker into the so-called high wheeler, or known as other names like the ordinary or the wheel or the penny farthing, that had 50-inch or more, somewhere anywhere between 45 and 55, maybe even more inches front wheel. And that allowed them to go faster. But of course, you don't want to use a wagon wheel for that. And so this is a moment of great technological innovation where spoked wheels, where there's a tension holding that wheel together, are invented. They have a rubber tire that's solid rubber, and they're bending steel tubing. And these bicycles were very fast, and they started racing with them. And they're 22, 23 pounds. And the very first person to ride a bicycle across the world, a guy named Stevens, rode one of these things. And so you can imagine how difficult that was before there really were roads. He had to spend a lot of time riding on train tracks, and has harrowing stories about crossing trestle bridges when there's no escape but for him to hang over the edge with his bicycle hanging below him as the train rumbles above. Those bikes were very dangerous. They were not very popular beyond a small set of people. They were very expensive. Who could afford them? And the danger was the header, and that would be flying over the front wheel and potentially injuring or killing yourself. And there's a number of people died from these. And so some of the people who actually created the high wheel by the 1880s are looking for safer modes of bicycle technology, and they developed the so-called safety bicycle. And that safety bicycle is very familiar to us because the basic concept is still around. And then Dr. John Dunlop, an Irish doctor who had a quote unquote sickly son who wanted to ride bicycles, but didn't like the jiggling. Dunlop invented the pneumatic tire. And so after 1888, you see now this bicycle, the safety bicycle, sort of takes over as the design that most people are really excited about. And so the bicycles I'll talk about tonight are the bone shaker, the high wheeler, and the safety. So sometime during the late 1860s, we think it's 1869, the bike arrives in Vermont, and it is the bone shaker. We know this because in St. Albans, there was a velocipede riding school at the Darrow Concert Hall. They held parades in St. Albans. The newspapers report that there was a velocipede fever raging in Montpelier. And there were also three-wheel velocipedes and so-called tricycles. And just recently came across this photo of one in St. Albans that a woman was riding. Throughout the 1870s, as bicycles sort of begin to take a different shape, this high wheeler, we suddenly see in the early 1880s, wealthy men buying these very expensive high wheelers, typically about 6 months' wages for the average person to buy one, so really out of reach. And these men were forming wheelmen's clubs, and that was to organize into proper riding, which was in military formation. You can see they also wore uniforms, and they had quite elaborate club logos and clubhouses. And in the state, wagon and toy manufacturers kind of started to catch the bug in the 1880s and began to convert some of their manufacture to bicycles and different kinds of velocipedes or high wheelers and safeties. And skating rinks were being converted into riding schools because no one really knew how to ride these things. And the thing that wheelmen loved to do most was to parade with a lot of pomp through towns and go on visits to other wheelmen to hang out with them and go on runs, as they called it. By the 1890s, that's the period that we now call the first bicycle boom. Interest in bicycles really explodes, and it's because they became a lot safer. Women started taking to the two-wheeled bicycle a lot, and it was hard for many people to gain access to tricycles because those were very expensive. So prices of bicycles begin to drop because the bicycle industry, which is really a very prestigious industry in the United States, begins to mass manufacture these objects. And so people in the middle class aspirants and eventually working class folks begin to get access to these. The roads were terrible, as I'm going to talk about later, and wheelmen and their allies fought hard to improve roads. And so it's getting easier to ride bicycles around Vermont in the 1880s. And retailers of all kinds kind of threw themselves into the excitement of selling bicycles. And we're using all kinds of advertising techniques to draw buyers in. And one of the things that's important to think about with a bike is even in the 1890s, as prices are dropping, in today's dollars, a $100 bicycle back then would be worth $3,000 to us. And that was pretty typical, a $100 bicycle. So they were very precious objects. And you had to convince people to buy these things. And so novel advertising was really being used. And about 10% of ads in a mid-1890s newspaper were bicycle-related ads. And that one historian argues that model of more and more advertising that the bike industry was pushing in newspapers helped other businesses see the advantages of advertising on a larger scale in newspapers, and it pushes the newspaper industry away from a subscriber model to a more advertiser model. So retailers are of all kinds are joining in on this. In Burlington in the 1890s, we had as many as 10 retailers who sold bicycles. And you can just sort of contrast that with today, where, we are going through another sort of bicycle boom or boom of enthusiasm here, but we have 4 or 5 bike shops with double the population. So the scale of it was quite large. And the hardware store, George Hager's hardware store, you could get your harness trimmings, but you could also go get a Victor bicycle, which is a very fine bicycle. Or the jeweler, LM March on Church Street had diamonds and watches, but they also had optical goods and bicycles. And E.H. Vancouver, who was an electrical supply and construction store on Church Street, had a bicycle department. We had one dedicated bike shop. It was typically, these were agents of bicycle companies, but we had one dedicated bike shop called Lane's Bicycle Livery. And that was a place where you could go rent bikes if you were a short-term visitor. It was really a mania that emerges in the 1890s. And this is a funny cartoon from 1897 that it's fun to look in the background at all the ways in which people were reimagining everyday life through the excitement of the bicycle. And new terminologies were being created for everyday activities that were coming from the bicycle. If you were hungry, you would say, let's pump up, which is like, pump your tires. So let's get a snack. But the bike was such this obviously satirizes it to some level, but it was being employed to sell all kinds of things. Drink bicycle soda, bicycle tonic, bicycle National Bank. There's a little reference up there just to the left of the clock, cures bicyclist diseases. Or bicycle face cured. There was a lot of concern about the new kinds of diseases that were associated with bicycling, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But it was a real mania. But by 1905 or so not too long after this cartoon is created, you see the bicycle moves a bit from the foreground to now increasingly in the background of people's lives. And that enthusiasm, that mania begins to really dampen. And to some extent, it's displaced because the automobile is beginning to arrive on the scene. And it becomes the focus of excitement. And a lot of these wheelmen just displace their interest and enthusiasm to cars. But the important thing is that the bicycle wasn't just a fad. I think that's one of the sort of take homes I want to make sure that tonight I communicate it. So because the bicycle was really tied to and precipitated some really consequential changes at the turn of the century, some of which we sort of live in the shadow of today and take for granted as just part of life. And one of those that I'm fascinated by is it brought in new ideas about the pleasures of being automobile. And by that, it's sort of a subjective experience of being able to sort of point yourself in whatever direction and just go and go fast. There was a real fascination with speed during the 1890s. And especially fascination with effortless speed. The idea that you could just sort of get on something and it would take you somewhere fast. And, of course, they had horses and buggies and they had trains, but horses got tired. They needed to be fed and bedded down. The bicycle could go however long you could go. The train was, of course, very fast, but people thought of it as and described it as kind of swallowing you up. You were on its schedule. You were not automobile on the train. The bicycle industry was a real cutting edge industry, and it laid the technological groundwork and the industrial groundwork for the rise of the automobile. The very first bike companies eventually started converting their production to automobiles. And the Columbia Bicycle Factory in Hartford, Connecticut was a real sort of paragon of assembly style 24/7 production in the 1890s. Thomas Edison had electrified it. And a young Henry Ford, who was a bike mechanic, went there on a visit to, the bicycle companies would invite mechanics in and others, retailers, to show them the power of their manufacturing. And Henry Ford was deeply impressed by the assembly line style production they had going there. And they were innovating all kinds of new techniques of industrial production, things like bending steel tubing and the ball, refining the ball bearing. There was also a reordering of gender relations, or at least a challenge to the way gender relations were assumed to be, as women were taking to the bicycle and demanding, first of all, changes in restrictive clothing. And you can just see in this image here on the left, this woman in bloomers. And the bloomer was quite controversial, but it was a move of women by women to make their exercise much more easy to do. And then that really gets pushed into other areas like new kinds of rights in the public sphere. The bicycle was also creating new ideas about leisure, how to spend your leisure, recreation, athleticism, and landscape, actually, as bicyclists are sort of the first long distance landscape appreciators. Like a lot of people would come to Vermont to ride bicycles and sort of appreciate the beauty of the mountains and so on. And it sort of lays some of the groundwork for the automobile tourism that takes for granted that it's a good thing to go look at landscapes. And people are really pushing their physical limits on bikes, doing incredible endurance rides and seeing how far they can really go. But bicycles also caused a lot of commotion and social conflict that can resonate a lot with what's happening today around bicycles, because cyclists are using bicycles in ways that are challenging urban propriety, and traffic laws were really minimal, and bicyclists provoked the creation of more formal and sustained efforts to create traffic law. There were bicycles got wrapped up in debates over the effects of urbanization and on people's morality and their bodies. And so religious leaders are decrying Sunday leisurely rides instead of going to church as this sort of example of moral decay. And Charlotte Smith of the Women's Rescue League she associated the bicycle with Satan. She said the bicycle is the devil's advance agent, morally and physically, and was warning against women taking to the bicycle. And then there were these diseases that people had to worry about, like bicycle face and monkey back and kyphosis bicyclistarum. And so let me explain what those were. Bicycle face was the contortions that your face would get frozen into from the struggle of trying to balance a bicycle, or from the kind of hysteria that one gets when you go too fast for too long. It was really targeted at women because it was thought to make women ugly, and so it wanted a way to get them to not ride bicycles. Monkey back and kyphosis bicyclistarum was the sort of hunchback that would happen because you were spending too much time bent over your handlebars. So in this talk, as I go on, I'm going to talk about Vermont's historical experience in that period of the bicycle. And I brought to this research some really basic questions, which is, who was riding and why? What did they see in the bicycle that excited them? What was it like to ride a bicycle in Vermont in the 1880s or the 1890s? And really, what were the roads like? I know they were miserable, but what role did bicyclists play in promoting better roads here in Vermont? So the talk is organized in 3 sections. The first is the wheelmen. I'll talk about these sort of elite social networks that bring the bicycle to Vermont and create clubs around it. The new woman, the relationship that Vermont women had with bicycling, and then good roads. There was a movement to improve the roads. So the wheelmen, here's the Bicycle Club of Swanton in 1893. These young men here are clerks, middle class, sort of probably have some higher level of education or bits of it. This is a time when wheelmen's clubs were thought to be the most appropriate way to ride a bicycle. It was riding in a leisurely and orderly fashion. As I mentioned earlier, bicycle riding was thought to be something that you could or you should do in military formation. There were captains and sergeants and buglers and the like, sort of modeled on cavalry units in some cases. Given that the high cost of the bicycle was still fairly prohibitive as early as 1893, these were men of means on some level. But they're a small club compared to some of the what was playing out in some of the larger towns and cities of Vermont. The Vermont Wheel Club is a really interesting story. It's effectively the second wheel club founded in the United States. The first was founded in Boston, and then the Brattleboro Wheel Club was founded a couple of years after that in 1880. It eventually changed its name to the Vermont Wheel Club in 1885. But Brattleboro was sort of the heart of the most exciting activities that a wheel club could imagine and execute. And so the Vermont Wheel Club was more than a bicycle club. It was all you had to have was status as an elite male to join this club. You didn't necessarily have to ride a bicycle, although many did. They were quite well-known competitors in bicycle racing throughout the Northeast, but they were doing all kinds of other things. They had a baseball team that they sponsored. They held a winter ball that if you were an aspiring politician in Vermont, from even as far north as Burlington or St. Jay, you might very seriously consider traveling down there to meet some very influential folks. And there's something about Brattleboro's geographic location that's contributing to all this, which is that the bicycle industry gets established in that lower Connecticut River Valley. So Brattleboro is, really within that economic sphere of industry happening. And so the bicycles really land in Vermont in the first wave from south to north. By the mid-1880s, we see a wheel club being established in Burlington, and that's standing in what is now basically City Hall Park. And I know more or less who these individuals are, and they were Burlington's elites. They were lawyers, they were doctors. But what's interesting is while the Vermont Wheel Club down in Brattleboro lasted until 1924, this club basically goes out of existence in Burlington probably about a year later, and it's because the Lake Champlain Yacht Club gets established. And so one of the ways that you showed your status as and your wealth and your progressive attitude towards technology and so on was to get a bicycle and to learn how to ride it. If you had sportiness, they called it. And so these gentlemen decided that bicycles were not enough very quickly, and they abandoned the bike and they went and bought yachts. So early bicycling was very much wrapped up with class status and wealth and sophistication and sportiness. Here's a wheelman from Burlington. This is Joseph Auld, who was a publisher of the Burlington Free Press and gained a couple of patents. He was a bit of a tinkerer, like many early wheelmen were. In this particular patent, he invented a gearing system for tricycles. He was also the author of a book called Picturesque Burlington, which came out in 1893. And it's sort of a tour guide, if you will, to Burlington. And the book only makes very brief reference to bicycles, but you can see the influence of the wheelman culture in pushing the appreciation of landscape and scenic views, in going out on journeys of recreation and leisure, the things he points out that you should look for are the very same things that when he was a wheelman, they were striking out to go do. In Rutland, there was a bicycle club that was founded early, and it didn't really last. It only lasted about 5 years, and then kind of just disappears out of existence. And it always intrigued me about sort of how and why that club came about so early, but then disappeared so fast. And digging into it, I found this fascinating dynamic around a skating rink. So wheelmen were very closely associated with skating rinks, as I mentioned earlier, and they would often buy a skating rink and use it to learn how to do tricks and to practice riding, hold classes, and also rent out the space for roller skating, which was also becoming popular at the time. But this club in Rutland decided to create their own skating rink. They hired some contractors to go out and build it. And on July 4th in 1884, it opened. It was a grandiose opening. It had cost them $15,000 to build this thing, which is about $400,000 in money today. And it held 1,200 people, 400 up top and about 800 on the bottom, and had a very sophisticated chandelier system with gas jets. And just a year later, the skating rink sold at auction for $2,325. And it just seems like, what the heck happened? Here they are at the bottom on a visit to Springfield, Massachusetts, one of their last hurrahs, really, before they disbanded as a club. And what happened was the skating rink, they took out a mortgage to pay for that construction, and they thought they would make it back in roller skating fees and concerts and things like that. But a clerk in the city offices of Rutland made a mistake in recording the actual mortgage, and relatively quickly, one of the people who put in the steam heating system slapped a lien on the club, and it basically, that clerk's mistake invalidated the collateral that they had put up to get the loan. So they basically had to sell it at auction, and they couldn't sustain their club enthusiasm after that. Down south again, Mount Kilburn Wheel Club in Bellows Falls, very active club, kind of within that Brattleboro sphere of influence. And they were led by a lawyer, H.D. Ryder was his name. And he would love to use the wheel club, not just for riding, but to as a space to hold mock court trials. And so the Mount Kilburn Wheel Club held, for example, in 1894, as this announcement talks about, a trial of a neighbor for the larceny of a Plymouth Rock rooster. And as it said in an article, aside from the rare fun of the occasion, the entertainment will be exceedingly interesting to ladies and others who have never attended a real trial. So wheelmen's clubs were doing all kinds of things besides riding bicycles. They were kind of, in many cases, the social center of the community. So they had a comic operas and plays and concerts and balls and ladies' night. The Upper Valley was also a real hotspot of wheeling. Their clubs from New Hampshire and Vermont would often get together. And in the mid 1890s, parading was a big thing of drawing as many as 500 people. And there's that image here of a special event that brought in several hundred wheel men and wheel women. And there's this little article to the right that describes what those people are doing there on that very occasion. And so I'm going to read it to you. This happened in 1895, and it was a bicycle parade at Woodstock. A bicycle meet and parade under the auspices of the Wabeno Cycle Club was held at Woodstock last Friday afternoon and evening, and was a brilliant and successful affair. Stores and residences were elaborately decorated, and in the evening, the entire village was beautifully illuminated by over 3,000 Japanese lanterns. You can actually almost see them in the picture there. The Hartford and Lebanon cycle clubs and cyclists from adjoining towns were present. The Woodstock Railway Company running a special tram. About 200 wheels were in line, and the parade was witnessed by several thousand people. There was a fine display of fireworks in the evening. Woodstock Cornet Band discoursed music, and refreshments were served to all cyclists and visiting friends in the town hall. So you can imagine thousands of people turn out for a bicycle parade, and it's sort of the event of the month, if not the season, to have something like this occur in your town. Something quite notable about this little reference to the Woodstock Railway Company cooperating by creating a special tram. Early wheelmen were very closely associated with trains. They, we recently, last few years, Amtrak agreed to allow bicycles to be on trains coming in and out of Vermont on a kind of a provisional basis to see if it would work. We're redoing something that early wheelmen had already kind of fought for before in the 1880s and 1890s, which was the right to bring their bicycles onto trains so that they could travel places. They fought hard to have their bicycles be counted as baggage and therefore free to carry with them. That didn't always succeed, but most railways were keen to support bicycle riders because they were also train riders, right? And Woodstock is interesting for another reason in bicycle history. And this was an image that I was shown, and you could sort of quickly move beyond an image like this until you look at that. And so this is an image of a guy's house named James Murdoch. He was basically a retail pharmacist in Woodstock. And in the background here is this really interesting contraption. And this is happening in Woodstock. Someone's got one of these things, and this is in the early 1900s. So what is that thing? And that thing has an interesting connection to Woodstock. And so it's called a Star Rider bicycle. And in 1880, it was invented. And between 1880 and about 1884, it was the premier bicycle that you would aspire to own. They weren't cheap, but they were a kind of a transitionary bicycle between the high wheeler and the safety bicycle. And literally what it was reversing that front wheel so that you're now sitting on top of it, and the big wheel, and then the smaller wheel up front would provide more stability. So headers suddenly disappear. And in fact, they were so stable that a guy named Hazlitt rode down Mount Washington in 1884 on one of these things. People played bike polo on these. They were making all kinds of speed records. And it had a unique mechanism of, instead of a sort of cranks and pedals, it had a treadle. And it was such a popular bicycle, a song was created about it. This is the Star Rider song and chorus. And the sort of Tiger Woods of that era, a guy named John Stout, was a trick rider, and that was his bicycle of choice. He could do all kinds of stuff like ride downhill or ride down the Michigan State Capitol steps. He was a very popular figure. What does this all have to do with Woodstock? Well, it turns out, so you can see in the Star Rider music cover there, it was published by the H.B. Smith Machine Company. You ask, why is a machine company sponsoring a song about a bicycle, publishing the music? And so H.B. Smith was a guy who was born and grew up in Woodstock, Vermont. And as a young man, he got very interested in woodwork and creating equipment that could facilitate woodworking. And he became very successful here in Vermont, so successful that he wanted to expand. And so he went down to New Jersey and bought a township and renamed it Smithville, which is in Burlington County, New Jersey. And there he created a big factory to make woodworking equipment. But one day a guy shows up and says, you have the kind of precision manufacturing equipment that I think would be useful to make bicycles. And I have this design, will you make it for me? And so that's how H.B. Smith got into the bicycle business. And this, as far as I know, the Star Rider was the only bicycle he made. So he eventually got out of the bicycle business. Now, what about the Northeast Kingdom? Since I've been eager to share with you some of the details, because enthusiasm for bicycles is really high in the Northeast Kingdom. There were multiple wheel clubs in St. Johnsbury and Lyndonville. One of the early wheel clubs, and by the way, I don't know much about these except what I've been able to glean from newspapers. And so I am super open to learning more if anyone knows, but the Mystic Cyclers were formed in the mid 1880s. And as this article from 86 says, a number of the Mystic Cyclers and some others who were not mystical enjoyed a moonlight run to East St. Johnsbury Saturday evening, some of the party pushing through to Concord. And throughout the 1890s, there were various bicycle clubs. And the club in Lyndonville and the two clubs in the 1890s in St. Johnsbury were often doing things together, as the newspapers report. There was also a fair amount of bicycle-related business happening there. And so the Fairbanks Scale Company produces a very well-known scale for weighing bicycles with precision called the bicycle beam. In 1895, it was the premier scale that, as a bike retailer or bicycle manufacturers, you would want to have, because it was super precise. G.H. Payne had what he called a general hospital for bikes, and he was manufacturing his own bicycle line. There weren't that many manufacturers of bicycles in Vermont, but it seems to have been happening in St. J on a modest scale. The top shop in Vermont during the mid 1890s in terms of sales was in Lyndonville. E.J. Blodgett, who was an insurance agent, was also selling a ton of bikes. And then in 1899, there was an effort of wheelmen to make a path that was a toll path, basically, that would connect Lyndon and St. Johnsbury. And they were at the sort of the cutting edge of, at the time, which was the bicycle path movement, which was as people were imagining the future of transportation between towns, the bicycle was the premier form of getting to and from towns. But people didn't want to have to compete with carts and buggies and so on. And so there was a bicycle path movement that was really taking off in some states. It didn't really take off in Vermont. In fact, this is the only this is the only path I've seen in Vermont, is that one between St. J and Lyndon. But it was happening in New York and the upper Midwest and so on. The hoteliers of St. Johnsbury got in on the act. Tourism was an important growing phenomenon and an important part of Vermont's identity and economy in the 1880s and 1890s. And savvy hoteliers and tour providers understood that wheelmen were a valuable clientele. And so here's a hotel that was hosting Wheelman's Day in St. Johnsbury in 1895, and they invited the Wheel Club from Littleton, New Hampshire over. They brought the Littleton Orchestra over, and there was a menu with all kinds of fine foods as they listened to and waltzed to all kinds of overtures and such. And so wheelmen would find almost any excuse to go on a ride or gather with other wheelmen. And there was certainly willing commercial partners in all of that. That's not to say that people weren't also suffering from their enthusiasm in the Northeast Kingdom. Reigate in 1895, this little tidbit from the newspaper: "Our town is just in the throes of a bicycle craze. One young lady, bent on leading the crowd both in point of grace and speed, made a mistake, fell and sprained her ankle, and now rides a wheelchair as being much the safest if it is a little slow." Or in Peacham in 1898, "Mary Griffin, who has been spending a few weeks at G.A. Stoddard's, was badly hurt last week while riding on a bicycle. Not being accustomed to riding, she lost control of the wheel and ran down a long hill and against a barn, throwing her with terrible force, cutting her lip entirely through, knocking out 2 teeth, and otherwise bruising her head." Lots of reports of bicycle accidents in the 1890s. But what wheelmen wanted to do was to promote safe and orderly riding, right? And they were often making pronouncements through the newspapers and otherwise to get people to pay attention to riding etiquette because they had to develop it. So here's a little tidbit from the Free Press in Burlington in 1895. "Always keep to the right, always keep your wheel clean. In passing another rider or vehicle, keep to the right. Keep off crowded streets unless you have urgent business there. Don't forget that pedestrians have rights. It often saves bitter thoughts." Or down at the bottom there, selecting a cycle teacher. I'll get to that in a little bit because that's all about etiquette. But here's one that's explicitly about cycling etiquette from the United Opinion in Bradford in 1895. I'll read it. "Every sport has its rules of etiquette, and a system of exchange of courtesies must be adapted to cycling conditions. A question that is causing a great deal of agitation relates to the mode of greeting among wheelmen and wheelwomen. Shall a man take his hand from his handlebar at the risk of taking a header in order to tip his cap, or shall he merely nod his head and say howdy? Shall a lady make a sweeping courtesy or merely nod? Instances are cited wherein men have tried to do that which they have been taught from childhood, and the result has been a hectic flush all over one side of their faces where the skin was caressed by the loving but somewhat calloused hand of Mother Earth. Ladies who have bowed too profoundly have been picked up tenderly by helping hands after it was all over. It is with reason, therefore, that cyclists are giving this matter serious consideration." So creating a sense of how to comport yourself, what are the norms of sharing space, right? And especially in towns and cities that are growing, new people are coming in, they're negotiating with each other. And then you've got this bicycle in the mix that is causing all kinds of trouble. It's scaring horses and pedestrians. And so wheelmen really wanted to promote a kind of orderly approach to riding. Of course, they also loved to race, which they called furious riding. And this is a little tidbit from the Bellows Falls Times about a race that happened in 1897 that went from Bellows Falls to Claremont, New Hampshire and back, and was sponsored by the Mount Kilburn Wheelmen. And as I love what it says in the article, it says a good share of the village showed up accidentally. But what is especially remarkable about this is that this is about a 40-mile bike race. And the winner got back in 2 hours and 9 minutes, which means he was averaging about 20 miles per hour, which is fast, right? Because these bicycles, not all of them, well, most of them did not have gears. They were, in essence, safety what do you call it? Fixie kinds of bicycles with no freewheel, no gears. And so if you're averaging 20 miles per hour, you're screaming down hills because this is a hilly route and somehow getting up those hills very fast. And so there was a real fascination with speed, and wheel clubs were a place where people were really testing some of the possibilities of going really fast. They also crashed a lot. And so there's a description of a mishap that happened involving a guy named Henry Grignon, broke the rim to one of his wheels and rode 2 miles farther before meeting his cousin with whom he exchanged wheels. He then rode on to Charlestown, where he secured another mount and arrived third in the race in spite of the mishap. And wheelmen love to participate in feats of endurance. And this describes an endurance trip that was quite remarkable. Two crack Woodstock wheelmen, basically they left Woodstock at 2:30 a.m. on a Sunday morning. They went to Littleton, New Hampshire, which is about 83 miles away. Their idea was that they would, take dinner there, which basically was lunch, and then ride back to Woodstock. But they decided to keep on going. And so they rode on to Woodsville, and they stopped in St. Johnsbury on the way. They spent the night somewhere there, and but in 23 hours, they rode 150 miles, and they had a short rest, and then they rode another 52 miles home, which is really remarkable. So this was the kind of material you would find in newspapers at the time, was reports like this of people really testing themselves, seeing how far they could really push the bicycle in their bodies. But here's the thing, scorching became a big problem. So scorching was this sort of the moral opposite of the wheelman. And a scorcher was someone who loved to ride fast, not in a race. But, furious riding was for racing. Scorching was what happened in towns and cities when young men who were quite enthusiastic would ride too fast, and not ride in that orderly fashion that wheelmen in their wheel clubs wanted to see. And the newspapers are full of stories about scorching. Here's one from the Burlington Free Press in 1899 that starts ominously. Another accident occurred Tuesday evening as a direct result of the ever-present bicycle scorcher. It goes on to describe actually a bike mechanic who worked at this bike shop, Frank Lane Bicycles, or Lane's Bicycle Livery. It's on Loomis Street. It's now student housing. It's still there. But Abner Loza was his name. He was scorching down Loomis Street, and he ran over Barney Buxton, a boy of about 8 or 9 years old who was unconscious. They called the doctor. He's bleeding, and he regained consciousness eventually, but according to the article, he couldn't remember a thing about the accident. So scorching was seen as a kind of a menace that came along with the bicycle. And what's interesting about scorchers is that they were often working class men. They didn't have the social stature to be invited to join wheelmen's clubs. And so there's a class tension element to the whole story of scorching, where it didn't fit the dominant paradigm of what bicycling was supposed to be. But of course, scorching was also people riding irresponsibly and fast and, causing accidents and so on. But the worst thing that would be possible to a wheelman was to be called a scorcher. And there's a funny tidbit, I don't have it in here, but there was a really hilarious tidbit in the Burlington Free Press. It was a sort of a parable, and it's about a wheelman who died, and he's at the pearly gates, and St. Peter asks, were you a cyclist? And the guy says, oh yes. He says, well, did you love to ride fast? And the cyclist says, well, of course I did. I was the fastest in the land. And St. Peter says, downstairs for you, you were a scorcher. So wheelmen wanted to get ahead of this before it became something that was imposed on them. And as I had mentioned, the Bellows Falls Club, the Mount Kilburn Wheelmen, were run by, their president was a lawyer. So he was really into writing legislation and coming up with legal mechanisms. As this article says, there's been considerable complaint of fast and reckless riding. It is better that the wheelmen take the matter in hand themselves. And so H.D. Ryder sort of pens this appeal at the bottom that says, we suggest all wheelmen carry lanterns and bells and keep to the right side of the street or on such bicycle paths as may hereafter be provided. So, they're trying to get a sense of regulatory control over bicycling. And it's during 1897 and 1898 that all over Vermont, cities and towns suddenly are beginning to pass bicycle ordinances, which are fining by sidewalk riding. They're requiring lights and bells and trying to put some order on all of this, as it had become enough of a crisis, if you will, that towns really felt like they had to act. Wheelmen got involved in other legal matters. This article was totally inaccurate. It's next to impossible to safely steal a bicycle in Vermont because they were stolen all the time. Here's an example of a bicycle thief who was being tried in Windsor County Court in 1899. According to this article, he took possession of a wheel in White River Junction, claiming he bought it from a young man from Hanover, which is, I'm in a college town here in Burlington. There's all kinds of people who come here, steal bicycles, because college towns are full of bicycles, and they were back then as well. So he sold it in Chittenden County. The value of the bike was $7, which is about $190 today, but this guy got 3 months imprisonment in Rutland. So no one gets 3 months imprisonment for stealing a bike today, right? But the prestige and the value of bicycles back then was such that wheelmen really pressed hard for strict sentences and enforcement of bicycle stealing. And in fact, at one point, Vermont had the strongest laws on the books. They were on the books. It doesn't mean it was in reality, but it was 2 years in state prison for stealing a bike. Now, what about the new woman? In the 1890s, women are taking to the bicycle in large numbers and promoting outrage about immodest attire and unchaperoned freedoms. But the other side of that was the excitement that a lot of progressive women and suffrage activists were projecting onto the bicycle as this liberatory tool for women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote that the bicycle will inspire women with more courage, self-respect, and self-reliance, and will make the next generation more vigorous of mind and body, for feeble mothers do not produce great statesmen, scientists, and scholars. And I love this little cartoon from the Londonderry Sifter from down south in 1897. Don't you think it rather risky to come so far alone on your wheel? She, hadn't thought of it, but if you feel timid, I'll see you home. There were close symbolic ties between the riding a bicycle and women's suffrage. And the suffrage movement, nationally at least, was very interested in promoting women getting on bicycles. Here in Vermont, not so much, and I'll get to that in a minute, but the newspapers, of course, took note of all of this. And there were a number of different columns and articles, some of which were describing what was happening with women in bicycling, and others which were advisory to women who were taking to the wheel. And I would say that most newspapers in Vermont, who initially were fairly resistant to women getting on bikes and fairly critical of it, but eventually they sort of either resigned themselves to it because it was just happening anyway, or sort of joined in. And the Burlington Free Press is a good example of a paper that initially was pretty skeptical, but eventually sort of started publishing more about women riding bikes. And so as this article says, the coming woman will be the woman whose mother rode a bicycle and thereby made herself fit to be the mother of the coming woman, says Ida Trafford Bell. There are 8 million bachelors in the United States. Watch the reduction in number as soon as the bicycle girl in bloomers is scattered over the land, says the American Wheelman. That same year, there was a tidbit also in the Free Press about selecting a cycle teacher. And this is around those questions of etiquette, right? And especially as women and men are encountering each other in new ways in public space, there was a lot of concern about sort of what's the propriety of this? What's the propriety of women's clothing? What are the immodest ways that women might be exposing themselves to men in unacceptable, morally dangerous ways? But this is an interesting little tidbit, kind of humorous. Most cycle depots will send up a man to teach any of their own customers, and many ladies have learned in this fashion. Personally, however, it seems to me that if one must clutch any male thing wildly by the neck and fall into his arms 10 or 20 times in the course of an afternoon, a relative or intimate friend is better than an unknown oily mechanic. And I should therefore counsel any girl who contemplates learning the safety to select her teacher with these unavoidable contingencies in full view. At the heart of suffrage sort of claims around women and bicycles was an interest in women getting control over their bodies and having the opportunity to exercise. And so here in Vermont in 1892, there was a big conference on the suffrage, the right of suffrage and the complete enfranchisement of women. And one of the keynote addresses was on physical training for women. And this address doesn't make one mention of the bicycle, which I noted that the suffrage movement in Vermont didn't really align itself with the bicycle very closely in ways that other states did. But at the heart of this interest in the bicycle is that it's giving women an opportunity to wear looser clothing. It's giving them an opportunity to have a legitimate form of being out and breathing fresh air and getting in exercise and physically training themselves. And there were women, there were celebrity women bike racers as early as the 1880s, but they were seen as one of the guys, quote unquote. But as more and more women are taking to the wheel, they're asking the question, why are we having so many restrictions placed on our bodies and how we're going to use them? And the bicycle is a tool to challenge that. You know, the temperance movement here in Vermont promoted the bicycle. They thought it was great and they were close allies of the suffrage movement. The temperance movement thought bikes were great because they said drunk people can't ride home on bicycles, or drunk men can't ride home on bicycles. The suffrage movement never really came out, at least as far as I know, in favor of bicycles, and they really struggled to make the case for suffrage here in the state. You know, even it wasn't until it was passed nationally that we really see it. Although women had municipal suffrage as early as the 1870s, you know, one of the questions, of course, is why did suffragists, you know, express ambivalence about the bicycle here, as this little bit in the Orleans County Monitor says, Miss Mayjune, do you believe in women's suffrage? Miss Janfeb, well, I haven't quite come to that yet, but I ride a bicycle. I don't think I have a really good solid answer for this, but there's various possible angles of this. I do think that there was controversy around bicycles to begin with, and especially around the controversial effects of bicycling on women in particular. And so I think suffragists knew that they were already fighting an uphill battle. They didn't want to get in other battles, perhaps. There was also a remarkable way in which Vermont women had already achieved a certain level of economic independence with the rise of tourism. So a lot of the farming-based tours are being managed by women. Women had pretty high literacy rates. They had the right to divorce. Vermonters, for the most part, thought that Vermont was already the embodiment of the American ideal of freedom. But in any case, the suffrage movement here in Vermont didn't really play up its relationship with the bicycle. And so I want to touch on the health debate too, because it was really targeted at women. So there were two sides to this story. One side was this idea that riding a bicycle is great for your health. The best RX is a ride. Take it instead of going to the druggist. The bicycle was wrapped up with what at the time was called hygiene and sanitary living, which was, so there was an article called Bicycling Hygiene in the Free Press in 1895. And they described bicycling as opening up the pores, which should be treated with ablutions of water. So there was a kind of a ritual that you would have to go through if you were out riding a bike. You should know how to breathe. Breathing through the mouth can cause heart troubles. And be sure your mouth doesn't get parched. It can affect digestion. Drink milk with a few drops of rum in it before a ride. But for the, the medical establishment was doing research on bicycling and its health effects. And in fact, there was a UVM professor in the medical school. He was a professor of nervous disorders. And he sort of was one of these doctors who said, yeah, no, bicycling in moderation is a great form of healthy living and hygienic living. But there were other doctors who were really denouncing bicycling pretty harshly. And that same year in the Free Press, there's this remarkable article about Dr. Heine Marks, who was the ex-superintendent of the city hospital in St. Louis, who is denouncing very harshly the bicycle. As he says, first, you have a kind of paralysis of the hands and contraction of the chest. This causes congestion of the lungs and leads to consumption. So he's making some connection here to tuberculosis and bicycles. Not sure how he made that. But furthermore, with men, rupture, varicocele, hydrocele follow, and worst of all, it destroys virility. With women, riding promotes amorous desires. Married women are especially liable to very serious mishaps. If the world is not depopulated by the rapidly increasing membership of the suicide club, the human race will die out by reason of lack of manhood and inability to propagate. So there was a lot of threatening language being leveled at women, especially who wanted to get out and be involved in bicycling. Although, I found a great quotation from one woman in the late 1890s. She said, well, first they said it was bicycle face that was the problem. And then they started talking about bicycle foot. Bicycle foot was basically your arches would collapse if you rode a bicycle with fine French boots that were in fashion then. And she says, and then they told us we would get bicycle foot. In essence, if you do this in moderation, you'll live a very great life. So I think Vermont women tended to sort of just say, look, I'm not going to get involved in these debates, but I am interested in the bicycle. So my last section, what about the roads? Well, the roads were miserable, and you can see it in this 1894 Vermont Highway Commission photograph. The Vermont Highway Commission was created in 1892 to basically go document the sad state of roads. The way we managed roads in Vermont up to that point, the early 1890s, was town by town, and whatever materials happened to be next to where the road was were what were being used. And the way you paid your taxes for a long time here in Vermont was you went and worked on a road crew. So there was very little road expertise in terms of building and maintaining roads. Typically, someone clearing a field would just take the rocks and stones and throw them into the road, and they would get eventually mashed down. It was a chaotic mess. And of course, wheelmen are confronting this and actually wanting to do something about it. But early on, wheelmen, they began to organize with each other, first of all, to share information about roads. And this is a really remarkable book that was published in 1887 by a guy named Carl Crone. His real name was Lyman Bagg. But anyway, he took a journey of 10,000 miles on a bicycle and had this really novel way to pay for it, which was he would sort of get intelligence on good places to ride from the local wheelmen. And then he would convince those local wheelmen to pay him a few dollars in exchange for him sending back a compilation of all those rides later on. And so this book is really thick. It's like 1,000 pages because a lot of it is just very detailed wayfinding and description of roads. And so as a subscriber to this, if you wanted to go on a ride or go traveling and ride, you had a sense then of what the roads might be like and what routes would be desirable to take because the roads were so bad. And so, this little tidbit from his Vermont section. Oh, by the way, if you ever find yourself locked in battle around Trivial Pursuit on Vermont themes, if anyone asks when was the first century ride ridden in Vermont, it's answered right here. The longest day's ride previously taken in Vermont was July 9th, 83, so 1883, by two Rutland boys, 100.5 miles. Then he just describes these roads. He says, oh, as a whole, they're fair, they're sandy in some places, in some stretches, they're unrideable, and so on. So this was how you got that intelligence. Later on, wheelmen created more formal sort of guides that you could buy by state to know what routes to take. But there was, at the same time, wheelmen are organizing. And in 1880, they create the League of American Wheelmen. And the goal of the League of American Wheelmen is twofold. One is to promote the overturning of laws that are denying bicyclists access, for example, to public spaces. Bicycle riders were banned from Central Park pretty much immediately once they showed up there in the 1860s. And so part of it's a sort of an advocacy group for bicyclists to gain rights and to protect their rights. But the other part of it is to promote good roads. And it's bankrolled by the bicycle industry. And Columbia Bicycle Company, well, it was known as Columbia Bicycles, but it was the Pope Manufacturing Company that was making Columbia bicycles. That was headed by Colonel Albert Pope, who was really the first bicycle industrialist in the United States. And he used a lot of his wealth to fund the other part of this League of American Wheelmen, which was to promote good roads. So the League of American Wheelmen had a sort of sister organization called the League of Good Roads. And it was very much promoting the idea that the government needed to wrest control away from local landowners and towns and do a much better job and a coordinated job at building good roads. And they had all kinds of strategies to promote this vision. Albert Pope traveled the country and gave addresses everywhere. In 1889, he gave this highway improvement address. An eminent writer says, the road is that physical sign or symbol by which you will best understand any age or people. If they have no roads, they are savages, for the road is the creation of man and the type of civilized society. There's a remarkable amount of references in this whole literature to the Incas and this sort of astonishment that modern Americans, progressive Americans know how, that with our technical know-how and our grit, somehow we're less advanced in road building than the Incas ever were. How could those quote unquote barbarians be better than us? That was sort of the language that these leaders of the Good Roads movement were using. They tried everything, like over here on the right, 100 Columbia bicycles given away if you are a high school or college student and you write an essay on the topic of good roads. The other thing Good Roads movement did was it went on protest rides. This was a trip to Ausable Chasm across the lake with a guy dressed as a frog with some kind of message about good roads on there. So, the notion of getting out and doing an advocacy ride, showing fun, having fun, but also making a political point is something that wheelmen innovated pretty early to promote good roads. And Vermont is one of the early states to actually take action on that issue. In 1892, Vermont passes the Vermont Highway Act, and there were only a handful of states that decided to take up good roads legislation. New Jersey, Massachusetts, a few others, and what that Highway Act does is it establishes centralized control over roads. So instead of leaving it to the towns, it creates that State Highway Commission that's out taking photographs of these terrible roads to get a sense of what's going on out there. And then it does something quite novel, which is called state aid. And it's basically charging new property taxes that are going to then be distributed back as aid to towns in order for them to build better roads. And then towns could also issue bonds. Levi Fuller was governor at the time when this legislation was signed. And he became quite a national celebrity for this, for signing this act. He was known as the road governor, in fact. He was a real proponent of good roads. And he was a businessman, you know, he was from Brattleboro. A lot of his business, he had an organ manufacturing concern, but a lot of his business was in the lower Connecticut Valley. But what's interesting to me is that wheelmen in Brattleboro and Southern Vermont, and really all over, were really insistent from the beginning of the 1880s up until this period when this law gets passed, through letter writing campaigns, through peppering their elected officials, enrolling military officials, agricultural interests, whoever they could convince to promote state responsibility over roads. And you can only imagine, he's from, you know, Brattleboro, the Vermont Wheel Club. This is the central social organization in that town. He was getting a lot of pressure from his peers, including his brother-in-law, who was a high-level official in the Vermont Wheel Club. So Levi Fuller was a true believer in good roads. And while he wasn't a wheelman himself, there is no doubt in my mind that he was fed a lot of information and a lot of pressure from his peers about Vermont being really progressive about how it managed roads. So these are all things we kind of take for granted today. It did take a while. It wasn't until 1910, 1915 that we really begin to see a statewide full on, you know, we're building good roads finally. This early stuff is more just establishing some funding mechanisms and really changing people's minds about the importance of good roads. And later it became more of an issue of, well, how do we build those good roads? But wheelmen are at the heart of all that. After 1900, you do see a new vehicle joining the story here. And as early as 1899, an automobile climbs Mount Washington. The Vermont Motor Company is established in 1902. And the natural audience for those motor vehicles was former wheelmen. You know, these were men with money and in many cases, a real strong interest in technology and progressive change, quote unquote. And the automobile sort of gained that reputation very quickly. And as I said earlier, the bicycle industry was already beginning to shift towards automobile production as early as the mid-1890s. The Burlington resident Horatio Nelson Jackson made a famous bet that's reflected in a Smithsonian Institution exhibit. Actually, they have the car that he drove across country. He made a bet. He was in San Francisco visiting some friends. He was a doctor here in Burlington, and he was sort of looking for more adventure in his life, and went to San Francisco, bet $50 that he could go out the next day and buy a car and drive it to New York. And so he's the first person to drive a car across the country. The Burlington Automobile Club gets established, the Gentlemen's Driving Club. So they replicate in some level that wheelman's club mentality to now, and they displace it onto the automobile. But, you know, parades are now involving automobiles. And so the Burlington's very famous 4th of July parade integrates automobiles along with bicycles and horribles and the typical things that they often were dominated by. Now, what happens after that? Beginning in 1910 or so, the story of the bicycle becomes one that's very familiar to us today. It's about the conflict between bicycles and cars. And, one of these articles sort of says, the typical Saturday night accident collision between a bicycle and a car happened on Williston Road. And so this is a very old story here in Vermont, as the bicycle had never really had to negotiate its space with motorized vehicles, but suddenly when it does, the bicycle's on the sort of the receiving end of the bruising of that. The laws are increasingly shifting to promote the automobile as the primary mode of transportation. And the bicycle really begins to fade, especially as a form of leisure, recreation, and transportation among adults. It's not that people don't completely stop riding bicycles, but the meaning of bicycles begins to shift across the United States. And it's much more of a kid's toy now. It's giving kids those same experiences of freedom and effortless speed and adventuring that early wheelmen were absolutely fascinated with. But increasingly here in Vermont, we see that bike sort of, retreating into the background. So that is the story of how the bicycle came to Vermont. And I want to thank a lot of people who have helped me with this research over the years. And I'm always interested in stories and photos. Maybe you've got some photos of great grandpa in your attic with a high wheel or something. I'm always really interested in seeing those kinds of things. And so with that, I want to thank you. And I'm thinking we hopefully have a little bit of time for questions.
Yes. Hi. Hi, everyone. Bob?
All right, so let's see here.
Yeah, we have some questions here. Thank you so much, Luis. That was, oh my goodness. I wrote down so many questions. But yeah, I wanted to, we do have some in the chat. I can read one, and Bob and I can tackle it here. There was one, let's see, by Kristen at the American Precision no, this was a comment. At the American Precision Museum in Windsor, birthplace of American precision manufacturing in the southern Vermont, Connecticut River Valley, one views many goods made using early precision manufacturing. I have not been in several years, but am I right in remembering that?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, I gave a version of this talk there at the American Precision Museum, and they do have some bicycle things on display. So this is the bicycle industry actually gets established in sewing machine factories. So when that guy, Colonel Albert Pope, the story of how he starts Columbia Bicycles is that he was at the Philadelphia World Exposition in 1876, and some high wheels were there. And he bought them, bought several, and he took them to a sewing machine factory in Hartford, Connecticut, because he knew they had the precision manufacturing equipment that would basically allow them to replicate these bicycles that he had bought. You might wonder about, was there some kind of patent infringement on that? There were a lot of patent wars over bicycle designs. And one of the things, some argue that the evil genius of Albert Pope was that he was quick to steal ideas and techniques and plans, but then he would immediately patent them himself and then fight hard. And in fact, there was one patent that he had to come to Montpelier, Vermont. It was owned by a toy manufacturer in Montpelier. It was for a particular piece of a bicycle that somehow they had bought because they were thinking of going into bicycle manufacturing. So he had to come up here and pay for that patent. But once he got patents, he locked it all down. In any case, it was the New England manufacturing tradition of precision work that was facilitating the rise of the bicycle industry. Now, eventually, the center of gravity of the bicycle industry shifts. And so by the mid 1890s, Chicago and parts of the Midwest, the industrial Midwest, are really important sites of bicycle manufacturing. So like, for example, Schwinn is based in Chicago, and they have a tradition of sort of farm, tools and farm machines. So heavier manufacturing. But so the American bicycle industry at its sort of apogee, at its most sort of innovative and technologically sophisticated in terms of industrial production, really began to combine that precision, New England history of basically weapons and sewing machines, that precision manufacturing, together with that more sort of large scale farm implement manufacturing. So this was the marvel of the industrial world at one point. It was a flash in the pan, really, late 1880s until the late 1890s. Yeah, it was all born here. They didn't make bicycles there in Windsor. They did not, but yeah, there were a few other bike manufacturers in Vermont. I didn't mention them. Down in Bennington, there was a company called the Bennington Bicycle Company. They had a few models, 2 models. Rutland actually had a few bicycle manufacturers. One company called the Coolidge Cycle Company had a bicycle called the Vermont. They also had the Rutland. And so I'm always keeping my eye on eBay because I've seen some Bennington bicycles. These are 1897, 1898. They'll show up on eBay every now and again.
All right.
What's up with the Horribles? Somebody asked.
Yeah, somebody asked.
Horribles are great. So Horribles are a interesting late 19th century New England phenomenon, created originally in Massachusetts, but they very quickly spread up to the northern New England. And so Horribles were, I'll put an anthropological spin on it. They were ritual clowns, you could say. Basically what they were citizens who would dress up in a kind of satirical way as important politicians and public figures, and they would lampoon them. And they would, when the Horribles are in the parade, they're criticizing and making fun of community politicians and leaders. And I want to bring Horribles back. I think we need Horribles again. They disappeared by the 1950s, I want to say, the 1940s. Sorry, I'm just looking to see if there are other, the bicycle scales at Fairbanks were used for what purpose? To promote their lighter bikes by weight, or were they trying to promote a heavier, sturdier bike or something else? They were, there was a lot of emphasis on lighter bikes. The idea was that, the lighter the bike, the faster you would go. So, the racing high wheelers, for example, were 20 to 22 pounds. So really, really light. And later the safety bicycles were heavier, but there was a lot of interest, especially among racers, because bicycle racing was the NASCAR of its era. And there were a phenomenon was invented by a guy named Thomas Eck. He was a Midwestern bicycle trainer and race promoter. And he invented what was called the 6-day race. And It was inspired by the pedestrian movement that happened in the 1870s and 1880s, which was basically endurance walking. And there were these celebrities of people, people who were endurance walkers. They would walk for days on a track and people would come watch, and you would see how far could they walk and how fast could they walk. Well, that got translated to bicycles as soon as bikes came out. And so he invented all kinds of endurance races that were really incredibly brutal. People riding 6 days, in some cases nonstop, riding 1,000 miles nonstop, maybe taking a few breaks and sleeping an hour, sleeping while riding. I mean, it was hallucinating, 6-day races. I haven't found evidence of 6-day races in Vermont. I have suspicions that they happened here. I just haven't seen any reference to them. But the 6-day race was a brutal thing, but people were just fascinated with speed, and they were fascinated with endurance. And then they were, of course, fascinated with crashes because what would happen is, after a few days of this, people would just start crashing. So by day 5, you've got maybe several thousand people showing up to a 6-day race to see what happens, right? That's when things fall apart and when heroes and heroines are made.
There's another question here. It asks, how do we find out about your bicycle history tour in Burlington?
Well, I simply need to be invited, really, to do it. I've done it through Local Motion. I've done it through the Preservation Burlington. I tend to like to do it through an organization just so that they can promote it. But if you are interested in something like this, I'd be willing to ask either of these organizations to do it. We're probably thinking more ahead to the spring, but it's like a 2-hour ride. And there's all kinds of interesting stories to tell about, what life was like in the 1880s and 90s. And then all the spaces in which bicycles existed or were being used or abused here in Burlington. So if you're interested, you can email me and we can go from there, and I'll try and drum up some interest from Preservation Burlington or someone else. Sorry, I should have stopped sharing. My bad.
Oh, Bob, I think you are muted.
It'll never end. just gesticulating wildly like a there's a question that asks, what was the license all about? It's from one of the articles that you showed, / controlled by who, and what was the purpose? That is the questioner was asking. It seemed to be that one of the bicycles had the equivalent of a license plate, I think. Does that? Yeah.
So what that was, it was a toll tag. So with that toll path movement, you would buy a little tag that allowed you to ride on that path. And so most of the time, these are just toll tags. There weren't licensing schemes per se, like the town didn't license bicycles per se. So it was most likely a toll tag of some kind. Well, I don't know if I see any other questions. If anyone has any questions, happy to.
Yeah, there was just one last one. I guess it's a perfect end. If you do a historical tour, can you please email everyone on the call? I mean, I imagine if you do it, Luis, you can let us know at Vermont Humanities, and we have access to everyone on the call, and everyone will get the recording after this evening. So yeah, we can definitely find out who was on the call and send you all a message.
Great.
But thank you so much, Luis. This is my second time coming to this talk, and it's always great. And I love how you personalize it to each town. So thank you. And thank you everyone for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. And thank you both for hosting.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.